The 1970s were a decade of rapid expansion for Marvel comic books, and there were some years where they would actually publish more than 20 titles a year. And as a result, with more titles, you need more artists. Who were these artists that produced some of these memorable covers? Well, this video is going to take a look at a number of these different artists who produced these great covers for Marvel during the 1970s. I'm going to list a number of honorable mentions, and then we're going to do a top 10 list. Okay, let's take a look at these wonderful artists.
To me, Bernie Wrightson's best covers were for DC, and while he certainly had some great covers for Marvel during the 1970s, there were only a few as he penciled less than 10 covers for Marvel in that decade. My personal favorite is Hulk number 179, but sadly I could never find a decent copy in person that wasn't priced right. Jack Kirby dominated the 1960s with his work, but his work at Marvel in the 1970s was within a shorter window of time. He worked at DC in the early 1970s and did some memorable work there with his Fourth World titles, but his return to Marvel was less than well received in the mid-1970s. He did some great covers for Captain America and other titles, but comic book fans were less enthusiastic of his work, compared to the previous work he did for Marvel in the 1960s. The energy was certainly still there, though. George Perez was right on the bubble for me in the top 10, and I'm sure many other people would place him in the top 10. I feel he would do his best work in the 1980s at DC, and while he did some great covers for the Avengers, his work was a little more uneven. Nobody is able to cram in the number of characters he does in a cover, though. Very close to making the top 10. There's one other special artist I want to mention, and that's Boris. He's in a different category of his own, as he only did covers and painted covers for various Marvel magazines. They are fantastic, and he certainly needs to be mentioned, but it didn't feel right to group him with these other comic book artists, who also did artwork for interior comic book pages. No doubt there are other artists who are worthy of mention that I didn't include. I didn't include John Buscema and Gene Colan, who were on my list from the 1960s. And it's not to say they didn't do fine work in the 1970s, but it feels that while their covers in the 1970s were good, they were perhaps not as strong as the work they did in the 1960s. With all the new artists coming into Marvel at the 1970s, I felt they deserved a bigger spotlight. As one of my reference tools, I used the Photojournal Guide to Marvel Comic Books. This was originally published in 1991 and put together by Ernst Gerber, and is very popular with comic book collectors. I showed some clips of this in my 1960s video and received a number of questions about this book. You can find these on eBay or Amazon, but prices can be all over the place. The first two volumes focus just on the golden age of comic books, and the third and fourth volumes cover Marvel comics that were published until 1990. There's also a special edition of the Marvel Comics version that has both volumes in one book, along with some extra pages. These are great, and they also have more information beyond just the covers of comic books. If you like browsing through comic book covers, these photojournals are invaluable. Okay, on to the top 10. In the 1970s, John Byrne didn't do as many covers as you would think, certainly compared to the artwork he did for interior pages in comic books at Marvel. At this time, his interior pencils were very strong, some of the best he ever did, but he didn't get as many opportunities to do covers. And those opportunities would become more frequent very late in the 1970s. John Byrne is synonymous with the X-Men, and he did some nice covers for X-Men. Before that, he did some nice work on Marvel Team-Up and Iron Fist. A very popular artist, John Byrne would go on to do some great work in the 1980s for Marvel and then for DC. Jim Starlin broke in with Iron Man, but really started to kick it into high gear with his run in Captain Marvel. The peak of this run would be this crushing Thanos cover with issue number 33, quite possibly one of the most terrifying Thanos covers out there. Interestingly, he would leave Captain Marvel for the reason that Marvel couldn't give him a reliable regular inker for his work, which is really a shame because Captain Marvel would never be the same title after his departure. You can see the steady improvement of his work in Captain Marvel, but he would take it to another level with his classic run in Warlock, creating some very memorable characters and covers. Much like his work in the 1960s, Jim Steranko would only do a limited number of covers in the 1970s, but they are so good that he deserves to be on this list. He only did 12 covers for Marvel in the 1970s, and it's easy enough to show them all here. His strengths, though, are not necessarily for superhero titles, but for other genres. I find the most interesting thing is that he did covers for what I would call B-level or even C-level tier titles. I was tempted to even put Mr. Steranko higher on this list, and he most likely would have been had he did more covers. Perhaps one of the lesser-known comic book artists of the 1970s is Mike Ploog, who had a short stint at Marvel and would later work in the film industry. Mike Ploog specifically worked in one genre for Marvel in the 1970s, and that is their horror titles. And he pretty much worked on all the major horror characters. His major work was on Werewolf by Night, with some very memorable covers in Marvel Spotlight that would carry on to his own title. He would also work on Frankenstein, The Living Mummy, and even a cover featuring Dracula in a crossover issue. He also did a number of covers for Man-Thing as well, and that pretty much covers all the classic horror monster characters. His most memorable character, though, is everyone's favorite Flaming Skull motorcyclist, and that, of course, is Ghost Rider. Ploog credits a lot of his influence on Will Eisner, who he apprenticed under. John Romita Sr. was still bringing it in the 1970s, and while he was still known to be the primary Spider-Man artist, he would branch into other areas as well, even to other genres and titles that are probably not well known to comic book fans and collectors. His cover work on the two romance titles are highly underrated and have become quite collectible. He did a lot of covers in the 1970s for Marvel, and some of the ones you may not be familiar with are horror and western. Many of these genres would not make it through the mid-1970s, with many titles seemingly vanishing overnight. Frank Brunner's magical run in Doctor Strange is something to behold. Brunner started at Marvel with a few fantastic covers for Chamber of Chills, but then started doing pencils for Doctor Strange's run in Marvel Premiere. His artwork got better, and Doctor Strange was promoted to his own title shortly after. He would do 6 magical covers for Doctor Strange to start off the series, and these are something else. Number 4 and 5 are some of my favorite covers of the 1970s and are really standouts. Brunner would also go on to pencil the first 2 covers of Howard the Duck, along with some Man-Thing covers. And like Mike Ploog, his stay at Marvel would be short. Too short before moving on from Marvel. Similar to John Buscema in the 1960s, Dave Cockrum had an explosive peak in the 1970s, tied into one particular title, as you may have guessed, the X-Men. There's a quality to these X-Men covers that are just breathtaking, and his work during this run would contribute to the great success X-Men would have going forward. He would also do a number of other great covers for Marvel at this time, and he would come back to the X-Men in the 1980s. His work didn't seem to quite capture the same level of intensity he had with his earlier X-Men work. There's a grace or elegance to Barry Windsor-Smith's work, which is something to say as the best covers he did in the 1970s are for Conan, the Barbarian. Barry Windsor-Smith is the reason why Conan became such a huge hit for Marvel, and the run would continue its success with John Buscema taking over the artistic reins in issue number 25. The title won numerous awards during his run, and many of the covers are outstanding, perfectly capturing the fantasy world of Conan. Incredible as well would be his interior work in the title. And these are what I would call peak 1970s comic books, the perfect blend of writing and artwork in a comic book. When it comes to doing covers, Neal Adams is one of the best. You can describe his style as hyper-realistic, and while he did a few covers for Marvel in the late 1960s, he would do a lot more in the 1970s. What comic fans may not be aware of, though, are the exceptionally painted covers he did for Marvel magazines, particularly for The Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. These are truly exceptional and are fairly difficult to find, which make them quite collectible. He would also do a number of other painted covers for other Marvel magazines, including some horror and fantasy mags. His style makes him a very popular artist for comic book fans to this day, and his covers are iconic. Number 1 on this list is Gil Kane, and while working on this list, this was really unexpected. If you look at the work at some of the previous artists that I mentioned, there are definitely some that have a higher peak. Where Gil Kane has them all beat is the sheer number of covers he did, and that they were of consistent high quality. He was the preeminent Marvel cover artist of the 1970s. Let me start by showing you just some of the notable covers he did for Marvel that would be very familiar with many comic book collectors. Marvel Premiere number 1, Ghost Rider number 1, Tomb of Dracula number 10, Marvel Premiere 15, X-Men 94, Amazing Spider-Man 101. Oh, and you might know these ones too. Amazing Spider-Man 129, Giant Size X-Men number 1, and Werewolf by Night number 32. Okay, Werewolf by Night number 32 isn't the greatest cover, but he also did the cover for Werewolf by Night number 33, which is in my opinion a much better cover. These are some serious heavy hitter covers. That he had his hand in the covers for all these significant Marvel comic books really says something. But it's not only that. Gil Kane's range is incredible. Not only did he do superhero covers, he did some great war covers for Sergeant Fury, along with some fantastic Western covers, which in my opinion are some of his best. If you are a collector of 1970s Marvel comic books, these Westerns are some of the most difficult to find from this era. Gil Kane has a long history in comic books and did some outstanding work at DC in the 1960s before coming to Marvel. His most notable contributions were for Green Lantern and the Atom. I mentioned before about the sheer number of covers he did for Marvel in the 1970s, and do you know what that number is? It's over 800. That's correct. Over 800 covers in that decade. That's more covers than what Jack Kirby did for Marvel in the 1960s. There are some months he did more than 12 covers, and he also did regular interior artwork as well. The range of covers he did, the consistent quality, and the sheer volume puts him at number 1. Now you can argue the top 5 covers by Windsor-Smith or Adams may be better than Kane's top 5, but no artist has so many important or well-known covers for Marvel in the 1970s than Gil Kane. Not even close.
There you go, the greatest Marvel comic book cover artists of the 1970s. Now, the 1970s is a treasure trove of different comic books, and it's a great period to collect comic books from. And while some of the key issues can certainly be pretty expensive, there are a vast number of comic books, and certainly some with wonderful covers that can be had for next to nothing. I highly encourage you to seek out some of these books to add to your collection. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out another one of my videos over here. Until next time, enjoy and read your comic books.